Hi, everybody. It's Mary Rowe from the Canadian Urban Institute. Really pleased to be here for the last session of day 2 of the City Summit being led by Massey College. We're very pleased to be partnering with them and with the support of Shirk and Maytree to have a conversation that has been really extraordinary in the last 2 days, just for the benefit of the mayors who've been busy advocating on behalf of the future of their cities. While you've been working at your desks and out in the community, just so you know, there's a whole bunch of folks over here that are talking about the future potential of governance in municipal government in Canada. And they're on your side, rooting for you, talking about the mechanics and the actual possibilities around the famous C word, the Constitution, and whether in fact that should be should that shut down a conversation, or should that be the beginning? So every constitutional fanatic that exists in Canada has been participating in this session over the last 48 hours. We've had lots of people coming in from international jurisdictions as well, talking about all the important components that they observe in their jurisdictions. And of course, one of the themes that's threaded through this is the legacy of colonialism. So I'm just going to acknowledge off the bat that I'm participating today from Toronto. The Canadian Urban Institute is a national entity. We have folks working and partners working across the country, including these three mayors who have been great supporters of CUI as we've been embarking on the COVID sort of recovery work, coping and now hopefully recovering work. But I happen to be in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples, and it's home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And we have 2 treaties that are covered here, Treaty 13 signed by the Mississaugas of Credit and Williams Treaty signed by a number of Anishinaabe nations. And we have been struggling at CUI and continue to try to foster a healthy dialogue about the legacy of exclusion that urbanism has reinforced. And it's certainly been talked about in the last couple of days about whether we can actually come out from under this colonial history. And I'm anticipating Mayor Bowman will speak a bit about that, because you were on a podcast run by Massey and around the City Summit around how you, I think, see reconciliation being fulfilled by a new kind of arrangement for Canada's cities. So I'm going to call on you to do that in a sec. But just to say that this piece around equity and whether or not equity can be achieved if we were to see these changes. So as I said, there have been several sessions starting yesterday, and I've been saying to people who said, well, what's this one with the mayors about? And I said, well, this is, and actually I said it to your chiefs of staff when they were asking for prep. I said, look, I think this is the rubber hits the road session. I think this is 3 practitioners who've been leading their cities and dealing with very tangible challenges: housing, mental health, transit, poverty, equity, land use, all the kinds of trade-offs that you folks have to navigate all the time with your councils and with your constituents. And I think that part of why this conversation is important to have you in is that it's all well and good for academics to be yakking on and on about, look, the perfect solution would be this, or why do we let the Constitution affect us like that? I think we're looking to you 3 to talk to us about, if you had different tools, if you had different governance arrangements, if you had more powers, would you be doing things differently? Could you actually meet the needs of your residents differently? Could you realize the aspirations of your city differently? I asked this very starkly in a meeting last week with city managers across the country about if municipal government was empowered differently. I appreciate it's a very harsh question to put. If you were empowered differently, would fewer people have died from COVID? And there was a sort of stunned silence to that question. I realize it's probably not an appropriate question because we're still fighting this and we're still trying to keep people alive. And I know municipal governments are on the front lines, and your staff have been on the front lines, improvising like crazy and trying to figure it out. So I don't want to be blaming in any way, but I do think there's that question about, if we were configured differently in this country, could we solve our problems more quickly? So really pleased to have Don Iveson from Edmonton, Bonnie Crombie from Mississauga, and Brian Bowman from Winnipeg, 3 of the beacons of municipal leadership in this country, to shed light. And because I'm going to go with beauty before age, I'm going to ask Bonnie first. So Mayor Crombie, can you set us off? Just give us a sense of what your perspective is in Mississauga and in Peel region, where you are in a multi-jurisdictional area with a region, and you've got one of the more complicated scenarios to lay out for us. So I'm going to go to you, and then I'll go to you, Don, and then I'll go to you, Brian. Okay, so Bonnie,
Mary,
to you first.
You want me to respond about what we would have done differently with COVID?
Sure. Yeah.
Let me just first say as well that we are Canada's 6th largest city, the 3rd largest in Ontario, because people think of Mississauga as though we're some suburb, but we're absolutely not. We're a powerhouse. Toronto, Ottawa, then Mississauga. There are 95,000 businesses here. 75 are Fortune 500s and 1,200 are multinationals. We are a driver of the economy. We are the second largest life sciences industries in all of Canada, right here in Mississauga. Plus, we have the nation's largest airport, which of course is a big draw for industry and manufacturing. So that's where we are. What would we have done differently if we weren't now? So I should put in perspective as well that we're two-tier government here. So not only federal, provincial, municipal, I unfortunately have something called the Region of Peel, and there are 3 municipalities that are part of the Region of Peel. Mississauga is the largest, and we fund 60% of the costs, and let me tell you, we only have 50% of the votes. So we're a little touchy about it, and so we're with Brampton, which is Canada's 9th largest city, and Caledon, which is a town of 66,000 people. And I will share with you that they bring 5 councillors to the regional table, and their town is the size of one of my wards. So we're a little touchy, as you can tell. Now, how would things have changed if we could have controlled the organization and the response, the COVID response ourselves? I think we would have done a lot of things differently. I would have, worked with the provincial and the federal government to look for manufacturing of the vaccine here, because we certainly have the capacity and we have the size and scale of companies that could have done it. And I would have gone there first, but sometimes this is all good in retrospect.
I know. I mean, I'm cautious.
Lessons. Yeah, had domestic production and things would have gone smoother.
Yeah, I'm cautious that even. Yeah, I'm even cautious about putting it.
And the outlay. So our situation here is we have a lot of community spread. Much of it is generated because of the nature of employment. We have a lot of manufacturing, warehousing, food processing, all of that. All the factory workers are here. The big Amazon plant that had 900 cases of COVID, Canada Post, etc. So I think we would have taken matters differently rather than vaccinate by age cohort groups, which is what we're doing in Ontario. I think we would have gone to the most vulnerable workers first that are really the source of the spread and passing it to households and into the community through community spread. So I think we would have moved on that quicker. Of course, you want to get your 80-year-olds, 70-year-olds plus, but at the same time, what about the teachers? What about the transit drivers? What about the factory workers in manufacturing, warehousing, etc.? Because that's the source of the spread here. It's different because of the density, because of the number of people that live. Mississauga is 800,000 people. Peel region is 1.5. So it's the density along with Toronto. That's why we continue to be the hotspots in Peel and in Toronto, driving the numbers of case numbers right across the country. We have been in lockdown now 4.5 months, and we just announced yet another stay-home lockdown. We haven't been out of lockdown since November, and longer than any other jurisdiction in North America. So why don't I leave it there, let my counterparts respond as well, and I'm sure I'll think of a few other things to say.
It's so interesting what you're suggesting, because some of it is also about data that, we know from CUI, we've been publishing these reports every 100 days, and we just couldn't get disaggregated data. It wasn't consistently available. So, there's going to be
lockdowns, Mary, as you know, they're not effective unless they're applied region-wide. So unless you're in the Golden Horseshoe and apply the lockdown throughout the Golden Horseshoe, people move. We know that. We know that through anonymous aggregate cell phone data, that if Mississauga is closed, people are going to go to Oakville or the restaurants, or Milton to shop in the outlet malls. And the people in Toronto go up to Markham, and in Brampton, they go up to Vaughan, whether it's shopping or restaurants. So unless you apply it, and as they've done this time, right across the province, they're not effective.
Yeah. So Dawn, I guess this is an interesting question that Bonnie's highlighting in a really profound way, that if local knowledge was the starting place for these policy decisions, could you imagine? You sit as the chair of the Big City Mayor's Caucus. You're talking to the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister every week. What's your sense of how things could be different if you had different powers and different resources?
Well, Bonnie raises some really interesting points about some of the metropolitan scale challenges. In Edmonton, there are 13 municipalities. I represent about 1 million people. I've got 12 other mayors I work with closely who represent another 400,000. Throughout COVID, we kept trying our best to coordinate our messaging to our public because they work and live in borderless ways.
Sure.
And so this is the limitation of, the idea of, if mayors were queens and kings, wouldn't things be better? Well, of what, right? If I was the governor of Northern Alberta, would I have made different decisions? Yeah, I would have closed things up a lot sooner in the fall. But the mayor of Calgary and I were in this showdown with the province back in November where we were looking at using our emergency powers, which are different than in Ontario. We don't have the same direct oversight over public health. So our emergency powers are more suited to natural disasters, which we have lots of here in Alberta. And so we actually looked at using our bylaw powers to enact restrictions if the province wouldn't. Now, ultimately, and tragically later than they should have, the province was dragged kicking and screaming to putting those restrictions in just before Christmas. But I think it exposes some of the jurisdictional limitations that we've run into. I think places where authority is very clearly delineated, and where you don't have particularly in a province like ours, where you've got not just urban and rural, but you've got mid-sized cities experiencing different conditions, and you've got 2 large cities that through the pandemic have been hit at different times. And so the pressure on the government caucus and cabinet, which is more from Calgary, was different when our case counts were way worse in Edmonton than they are yesterday when things were finally locked down, because things are getting worse in Calgary again. So the point is, I think rooting it in at the metropolitan scale and then building our governance around that so that we cannot have these urban rural divides and not allow a place like this to get sort of oscillate back and forth between Calgary hegemony and Edmonton hegemony, but say, okay, there's sort of a catchment and there's 15 metropolitan regions in this country that drive its economy, where 90% of people live, where 95% of GDP happens, and not to discount for a minute the importance of rural and remote and northern communities where resources are from and heritage is maintained. But it's all part of a larger Canadian ecosystem. And I think we've allowed federalism and these lines on a map. I mean, Albertans complain a lot about cockamamie ideas out of Ottawa, but most Albertans don't realize that Alberta is a cockamamie idea from Ottawa. It's a construct. It was made by law in 1905. Before that, it was the Northwest Territories, or as I like to call it, the good old days. So, honestly, there are points in this crisis where I've thought to myself, and when the Buffalo Declaration came out, which if you want to read the best denunciation of the Buffalo Declaration, look at what the chiefs from Treaty 6 said and know exactly how far it's going to go. But I started thinking, and actually Mayor Clark from Saskatoon and I were kind of thinking about an April Fool's joke last year, which COVID completely swept away, where we were thinking, really what we got to do is just take the line between Saskatchewan and Alberta and rotate it 90 degrees. So the nice people from Saskatoon and Edmonton can do our stuff. The folks in southern Saskatchewan, southern Alberta can complain all they want and see how far that gets them. We've got the trees, the oil, the gas, the trees. I mentioned trees, the fresh water.
The trees.
We got, and so we'll be fine, right? But or just revert to territorial status at this point. But no doubt in my mind that if the premiers and the prime minister weren't engaged in this ridiculous Canadian dance, which I think COVID has exposed for us, fewer lives would have been lost and the economy would be in better shape.
Yeah, it's like a differentiated federalism or something, or what Bruce Katz is calling a perpendicular federalism, because he feels challenged by it in the US as well. Brian, let's talk with you. You've got each of you has a very particular circumstance, and I appreciate both Bonnie and Don situated their city in the region that it operates in and in the political environment that it operates in. So can you do the same for us in Winnipeg? And then I see that Natalie Delacy has a question, and so does Charles Mayer. So we'll go to you, Brian. Just give us a sense of the context for Winnipeg, could you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's great to join everybody. I'm coming from Treaty 1 territory, traditional homeland of the Métis, and the source of our drinking water is from Shoal Lake, Treaty 3 nation, or Treaty 3 territory, I should say. I mean, we're We're in the right in the geographic center longitudinally of Canada, where east meets west. We are the 2-year defending Grey Cup champions here in Winnipeg, which we hope there's a season this year. But you know what's interesting about COVID, when I take the comments, both Mayor Crombie and Mayor Iveson, and I'm going to revert to first names because that's typically how we refer to each other, but Don and Bonnie are raising great points. What's unique about Winnipeg is unlike Ontario, where there's a number of major centers and 2 major centers in Alberta, we're it in Manitoba. We have, of course, Selkirk and Brandon and Steinbach and other communities, but the majority of Manitobans all live in the city of Winnipeg. And so that does present some unique opportunities and challenges in respect of a relationship with the provincial government. What I would say to answer your question though, Mary, is if the municipal governments were really running and calling the shots in the COVID response and recovery, I think what you would see is much greater responsiveness, openness, transparency, and accountability, because that's what municipal governments do and do every single day. We have to be more accountable because we're more accessible and we're more transparent than any level of government. And I think that would have lended itself to being more responsive in a timely way to some of the issues that we're talking about. Don mentioned, of course, moving quicker, Bonnie, in terms of even some of the lockdowns and things. We moved first on masks. We moved before our provincial government even moved, because we could see what was coming and we could respond in a much more nimble way. You know, we've had our emergency operations center open since last year. It's the longest activation of our EOC in the history of the city of Winnipeg. The province closed theirs last summer. We've been on the ground, and of course, when you're talking about all of the functions of government that provide the services that you need during a time of crisis, they're at the municipal level by and large, not exclusively, but by and large. Clean, safe drinking water, emergency services. When you call 911, we answer the call. And so, you know, we have been lending our insights to the provincial government on traffic management around vaccine centers, you know, traffic flows. We've been responding to emergencies in our personal care homes when the provincial systems failed to epic levels and obviously having deadly consequences. People called 911. They called the city of Winnipeg in our case to go answer that call. And so I think what you would see is a nimbleness and innovation that we're not seeing. We're not seeing at our provincial level, and the outcomes, which we get measured by in our budgets, we get measured on outcomes and scrutinized more on outcomes than on rhetoric than other levels of government. I think that people would demand, and I think we'd be more responsive to some of the issues. Right now, our vaccine rollout is hitting some pretty big challenges.
Yeah.
And the outcomes have us amongst the lowest of provinces right now for getting shots in arms in a timely way. So we're trying to lend a hand. And maybe I'll just wrap up by saying one of the challenges is because municipal leaders are consistently rated amongst the most trusted, we have an obligation to not rattle the community who's looking to government in a time of crisis to work together and is expecting us to work collaboratively. But then we also have to call things out when they need to be called out. And this daily tension we all have of how much do you kind of sound the alarm versus you know, just try to provide some unity when that is genuinely needed for the benefit of our residents. And that's a challenge that we continue to have.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you've had to exercise extraordinary self-control, all of you, because you just can't, as you say, more noise, more dissent when people need certainty and they need to be reassured. I get it. So I appreciate that. But I also know that part of this conference and part of what the organizations like ours are trying to do, and the Massey College is leading in this particular instance, is to forward think. You know, what do we come out of this with that is a systemic change that gets you into a better place, so that the things that were dysfunctional before COVID that now we really see won't be in place. So Natalie's asking specifically, Bonnie, I'm going to come to you. Here's what Natalie's asking. Specifically, the legal space of cities. She's saying, is this a moment where we could rethink fiscal capacity, immunity, not being overruled, so that you could actually provide the leadership that you understand is the right thing to do, and then the authority to make decisions? Those three areas. Do you see COVID as an opportunity to advocate and make some real change? Bonnie, over to you first.
I just want to make a few comments as well. It has certainly been hamstrung for us to be part of a region when our numbers were so much lower than other municipalities in our region, and we could have been in different categories of openness versus what they were. So the region was a challenge, being part of a region. And also the provincial government, let's say that we don't feel that all the decisions, as Brian was talking about, Mary, you were speaking about, have been based on science and data. Some of the decisions and definitions of essential workers, of essential workplaces, what was chosen and why. We felt that there was a great lobby effort for some and not for others. For instance, why could people get massages, but yet, other very fundamental businesses be closed? Big boxes were open and they could sell non-essential items, yet small retailers had to close, as well as restaurants and personal care providers. There was a lack of transparency too. For instance, we finally learned on the vaccine rollout, Brian just referenced it, so it occurred to me that I'd been being told by our provincial partners that we had received more than our allocation of vaccine because we were a hotspot, we were the inferno. And when the numbers were finally released, it was proven that we're 10.5% of the population of Ontario. In Peel, we received 6.8% of the vaccine, and we have 20% of the cases. So, without data to make decisions, and full transparency, because not until that transparency were we able to right that wrong and insist that more vaccine be sent to the hotspots. We shouldn't be receiving 10% of the vaccine. We should be receiving 20% of the vaccine, because that's the number of cases that we represent. But just to respond to your question, I think what people want to see and long for, to have confidence, is that collaboration and that cooperation between the three, or four, in my case, four levels of government. They want to see us working together. They don't want to see the pot shots being taken from the federal government to the municipal. We've given you this number, this amount of vaccine, and you've used this, or the border issue at the airports. We saw our provincial government at the airport saying borders should close and there should be testing. Meanwhile, we know it's a federal responsibility. So all that is unnecessary noise. People need to see us all working hand in hand, notwithstanding what partisanship, what party you may represent. All levels of government needed to work together. So is this an opportunity to change things?
Well, maybe, after the crisis,
After the crisis, what it's proven is that we do need revenue tools. For instance, what was very apparent is we came out of this with $100 million operational deficit. We had the ability to mitigate about 60% of that, which was great news, through a lot of measures that other levels of government didn't have to impose, such as very strict abandonment of any kind of discretionary spending. We had to lay off 2,500 staff. No other level of government laid off people like the municipal governments did. We took cuts personally as well to our expenses.
It's kind of crazy though, don't you find? I mean, it's a bit crazy, Bonnie, because your workforce is at the closest level of people requiring immediate support.
And we're paying for essential workers as well.
We're paying for essential workers.
We're paying for essential workers. So what would have been, necessary is, and of course we all know that we can't take on debt, at least in Ontario, we can't take on debt. Right. So we have to run a balanced budget, no deficits. Well, we can take on debt, I shouldn't say that. We can't run a deficit. So it's very important that we get back to zero, and we had to lobby the federal and the provincial government for handouts, for safe restart funding. Otherwise, we would be in a very significant financial crisis because of our operational deficits. And of course, the airport took a big hit to their passenger counts, and that's a big source of my revenue as
and
well.
transit,
So
right? You haven't got transit, you haven't got parking. You know,
we've got transit, we've got parking, all of that.
all these
you know,
revenue streams.
the ability to control our revenue and, you know, look for different sources, sustainable, certain long-term funding that we control, not ask for handouts, because I wouldn't have been balanced if I didn't get the handout, right?
And the fact that
could have built his toll lanes if he was given the handout.
And so the fact is that you have to, and even the fact that we have to call it a handout, you know, this is, I mean, this is the dilemma. You guys have this conversation all the time in your circles, but if you go outside of our people, regular people do think that municipalities need a handout. That's what they perceive, that, you know, somehow they need help.
Rather than giving us those sustainable tools, those revenue tools that allow us to build our 21st century cities, right? Not with 19th century tools.
So can you take it, Dawn? You had Rebecca Alty, the mayor of Whitehorse, is on with us today. And do you feel that you can go back? You had a charter. You almost had the charter for Edmonton, Calgary, and then the new government came in and you know, Rebecca's making this point, even though she's the lead of a smaller municipality, Yellowknife. But sorry, I think I called her Whitehorse. Rebecca, forgive me. I've done it before, Yellowknife. You know, do you think that you can have another kick at this can and get an urban development agreement or get a charter or something? Do you think? I don't know. Have you lost your appetite? I know you're not running again, so I don't know. You're going to let your successor say over to you, pal.
Let me say I feel a sense of unfinished business around the city charters. Mayor Nenshi and I labored for many years with, I think, 5 premiers altogether to get them done. And there's still some residual charter elements. We still have a few special powers. None of them really materially assist with revenues at this point. The most significant portion that we did have, though, that we negotiated with Rachel Notley's government, and interestingly was supported by Jason Kenney, then in opposition, very strong support in the legislature for the fiscal component, which was essentially a revenue sharing, statutorily protected revenue sharing deal that was both ups and downs. And so as we helped create prosperity that would help grow Alberta's economy, and the cities play an essential role in this, we'd get a piece of that. And we thought it was, by the way, the arrangement that should apply to all municipalities ultimately in Alberta. But if there was a downturn, as there often is in Alberta, that we were prepared to take that, because frankly, you know, getting on the 3% average growth train with the ups and downs was better than getting it announced at $1.3 billion a year of municipal infrastructure. It never was more than $1 billion. And every time we had a downturn in Alberta, it got a 20% cut. Every time the economy came back, we were told we were lucky to keep it against other priorities. So we never got what we were promised. And we thought a law that was supported by the then government and the opposition, and then was in both parties' platforms, would survive. And yet it didn't. So what that tells me is that without constitutional or some sort of super charter protection that is beyond the whim of the legislature in 3 readings, there really are no guarantees for municipalities in this country. I mean, we've seen that from election jiggering in Toronto with the cut in the number of folks, and that's before the Supreme Court right now. And all of us have chipped in on intervening on that, because if municipalities are going to be third-class citizens, fiscally and democratically, Canadians need to know that. Because I think once they know that, and I think they can see from this crisis how fragile our position has been, and I think many Albertans understand how what the challenges are that the cities have gone through with this particular provincial government, that there really is a time for change. Now, what does that change look like, practically speaking? I mean, I think it does involve either statutorily protected revenue sharing or more robust own source revenue. Now, I will say one last thing on revenues, and I do think user fees for certain things. You know, I've got folks here advocating very hard for free transit, when I think the answer is actually roadway pricing. So you can't do demand management, and you can't pay for stuff if you give everything away for free. So it really breaks my heart that so much advocacy energy is being spent on an impossible dream, from my perspective, of free transit. when the real answer is to get pricing right so that you can build and maintain infrastructure and service it properly. And that would be roadway pricing, which is hard for people to talk about. But since I'm not running again, it's easier for me to say it now. And we're not going to get to our city plan goals for density and smart growth. And we're not going to get to our climate goals without it, quite frankly. So we have to start raising the level of conversation about that in this country as an own source revenue. And then ironically, I've kind of come full circle on property tax because it is regressive. It is a wealth tax. You know, the fixed income senior or the family who's lost one or two jobs in this pandemic still has to pay it because it's based on the notional wealth of whatever the building is, whether it's for the small business or whether it's for the family. And that regressiveness, that inflexibility, that inelasticity is really not fair to people when they're struggling. But it does make it the most stable form of taxation out there, which for organizations that can't run a deficit, to Bonnie's point, is not a bad point of stability. Our revenues proportionately are much more stable than the other orders of government who've imploded. But as they all recover, we need to sort it differently. And most importantly, we need to get to an arrangement where the resources for issues like housing, for example, actually flow to us to improve the social determinants of health. One, so we can improve participation in the economy. Two, so we can improve public health outcomes outside of a pandemic, so people interact less with a public healthcare system that's less and less sustainable as the population's less healthy. And then third, when you get into a pandemic or other national crisis, you're not having to fire more money borrowed from the future at temporary shelters, which are a band-aid not just on short-term homelessness, but failed policies of colonization and systemic racism and so on and so forth. But we deal with all of those every day as mayors. And every time we try to point the fingers, even jurisdictionally correct at provincial and federal governments, people tell us don't pass the buck. So there's nowhere for us to hide, which is why I think we're the best bet to make Canadians' dollars go further to get results all across the board in all of these areas.
Don, just can we take property tax as an example, just in terms of something that for which I'm more familiar because of COI's work. If you decided that coming out of COVID, you were going to have to alter the relationship of property tax to independent businesses on main streets versus other parts of the city, am I right that in fact you would not be able to do that? That the province would have to enable you to do it?
Well, under some recent legislation, the new government has given more authority and flexibility for property tax incentives, but it's really geared towards attracting new investment rather than sort of discriminating between different taxes. And how do you discriminate between a chain franchise that's owned by a family from your community and a small business? So you get into a lot of issues of equity and taxonomy and actually rolling out. And that's why we tend to believe that support for business in terms of variable taxation is much more easy to finesse and fair across something like a metropolitan catchment to be administered provincially or federally. So that said, we do have some additional flexibility on that now in Alberta. Whether we would use it in that way, I'm not sure, because at the end of the day, it isn't strictly speaking the business that pays the tax. It's the owner of the building who pays the tax, who has this asset. Now they may charge it or pass it along, and that may eat into their rent. Practically speaking, it's a tenant who makes it viable to pay that tax, generates the value that's taxable in the first place. But that's not a clear answer to your question, but I think every time we've looked at this, because it's our instinct to say, how can we support? We tend, instead of looking at tax abatements, which tend to be longitudinal, to look at grant programs for direct and immediate relief, which is more what we've focused on in terms of business support. And
I see a question from Rebecca Alty, who I understand is the mayor of Yellowknife, saying that she had this debate in council yesterday about could they not in fact tax chain stores differently than independents, and these levels of detail that regular folk have no idea that you're trying to create certain kinds of outcomes and realities on your main streets. Brian, can you talk to us a little bit about the fiscal capacity, I guess, is the question. Natalie is pushing on it in the chat and saying, do you want a new kind of equalization? Do you want a different kind of formula? Yeah. Or do you want to have your own tools and I'm a voter and I'm going to hold you responsible for how you collect my money and how you spend it?
we should be masters of our own domain. The fact that we get such substantive operating and capital grants from provincial governments, and in this year, we got bailed out by the federal government, which really helped ensure that the critical services that we offer during a crisis were maintained. But the fact that that's necessary should amplify the dysfunction and unsustainability of the current model. I think to answer your question, though, that you initiated this round on, which is, can there be improvements? And I'm paraphrasing. Can there be improvements going forward or coming out of this? I think one of the effects of the pandemic is individuals and families are reassessing what's important to them, and that I think is, I can just speak for my family, has been healthy. I think cities and those that love cities like we all do are also having that same conversation. And I think we're reassessing what cities mean and how we can make them stronger and more resilient for the residents that we serve. And so a lot of robust discussions about not just transit, but active transportation and so many other important topics that I know are canvassed by everybody on the call on a regular basis. We're having those discussions, and I do expect that we'll be able to strengthen how we provide services to our residents going forward as a result of how we've had to adjust during the pandemic, because we're actively, like a lot of municipalities, looking at, okay, what makes sense, not just in a pandemic, but just as smart city building going forward. To answer your question though, on the fiscal though, the question really should be raised to the premiers. And because we are creatures of the province, until we get a premier who says, I'm going to lead, and we're going to use our municipalities to lead us and give them skin in the game so that they're focused on the things that we all say we want them focused on. They'll say they want us focused on economic development, but then they won't give you a piece of the pie to incentivize councils about job creation, employment data, and the things that we really should be debating more. Until you get a premier who says, we're going to lead the country on this, it's not fundamentally going to be changed. And we've been talking. Yeah.
If one of you could run for premier, maybe that's the answer. Dawn, just saying, Bonnie, one of you. I think the dilemma though is, what tools. Here's what I think is the dilemma. You guys are saying we want more tools, we want more money, but then you end up being in an obsequious position, going to the provinces saying, please. So I don't know how to get rid of that dynamic so that you just take it. That people don't give power. What is that? You got to take it. Go ahead, Brian.
Mary, yeah, I actually don't need more money. I need smarter money. Residents are tapped out. They're getting taxed enough. And we all know that we're going to have to pay the piper with the debt that's being put on by both federal and provincial governments. So I actually don't think municipal governments are good at working within the framework that they have in terms of the financial dollars. We'll make decisions that are smart. Of course, everybody would like more money, but give us skin in the game. And so to Don's point about property taxes, I've been a critic like him. Property taxes are from feudal times. They're archaic, they're regressive, they're a dumb form of taxation. To Don's point though, one of the things that the pandemic has shown us is the stability for governments. But if we look at it through the residents' lens, give us skin in the game in terms of maybe consumption taxes or something else. And maybe it's a blend of the two to create that cushion for municipalities. But then you need a premier who has courage. We haven't really seen a premier that actually has the leadership skills or the courage to make fundamental changes so that the recovery is led in Canadian cities based on the things that we all say and talk about during elections.
Well, feel free, all three of you, to use this platform to make an announcement of your candidacy. We'd be delighted to hear it here first. Go ahead, Bonnie.
That's where those two are going. I wondered. Too early for you guys to retire. I think we get rid of the provinces. That's what we do. We did a couple of education missions to Europe. One was to Sweden, and a lot of the countries in Europe, and Mary, you'll know this, they have regional governments, but the municipalities get all the funding. They get a share of the income tax. I know the light here happening on my face. Municipalities get a share of the income tax. That's where we should be going.
Do you want it? Do you want that? Do you want that? Do you want a
Sure,
share of income tax?
I think we all agree that property tax is regressive. I mean, how much can we increase an individual's property tax each year? In Mississauga, we're really fortunate. We're a very strong business tax base. So could you shift the burden to the businesses and take it away from property? I don't think you'd want to. You would put that burden on business, or they'll find somewhere else to land. But we're about 65-35, so we're doing pretty well. And when I look at where our revenue comes from, and this will probably be similar, and if not, let me know, but we're under 60%, 57% our property taxes are, our flow of revenue. Our user fees are 20%. Provincial gas tax, other revenues and transfers under 10%, nine and a bit. POAs, other revenues, fines, 5%. Payment in lieu of taxes, what I get from the airport, are at 4%. Dividends from our utility, 2%, and just others, 3%. So you see that we're just over 50% our property taxes. So we've had this discussion, and Mary, because you've been party to it, those other taxation tools for cities here in Ontario, and what would that look like? And we all know Hazel, my predecessor, and David Miller came out with the 1 cent GST, and that didn't go anywhere. And then we had AMO asking the province for 1% of the HST, and that didn't go anywhere. And then we had Kathleen Wynne, who you work for. You did the study. And there were a number of revenue tools that were examined very closely, and you narrowed it down to 4, the 1% of a regional HST, parking levy of 25 cents on commercial lot owners, a GTHA-wide 5-cent gas tax, and 15% increase on development charges. Well, we don't like that, because obviously that would make development go elsewhere and they would stop building. And we know that with those 4 revenue tools, we would have had $2 billion a year to distribute among cities. But it's always perceived as an increase in taxation, and nobody wants to stand up and say, we're increasing your taxes, we're giving this tax authority. Now, the largest inequity here in Ontario is something called the Toronto Act. And John Tory has a number of taxation tools that are only available to him that none of the rest of us do. And the big ones, which are significant, land transfer tax on real estate would mean 100 million to me. Vehicle registration tax, then there's a parking tax, hotel tax, land value capture, etc. A number of taxation tools that only the City of Toronto has that none of the rest of us do. And I don't know why we don't. I think they feel that we wouldn't raise our taxes adequately. There is some discussion that Toronto doesn't, because they are cross-subsidized with these other tools. So don't give them to other cities, or they won't be responsible in their tax increases or whatever that is. They can't manage their money. And we all know that that's not true. And I think we're the best fiscal managers, the municipalities, and we're not permitted to run deficits. And so, of course, we don't, except in the year of the pandemic.
Bonnie, what about if we move to a place, and I'm interested whether Don thinks this is feasible with his negotiations with the federal government, or the provinces for that matter. What would happen if we moved to a place where a municipality could opt in? In other words, the things that you're saying are out of reach because they're only available to the City of Toronto. If
we said that, Mary.
If the City of Mississauga said,
give us that suite of tools and let our councils decide which is appropriate for our city or our region.
Okay, so let me just
employ.
Right, so let me just go to Don, because Don, when CUI was in Edmonton in the fall, and we had a whole week of our CUI local program, as you know, and we had a public session with you, and you said, I want my other regional mayors to be on the session, small communities, Red Deer and others, and Grand Prairie, I think, and they said, let us choose the tools that we want to use. They didn't like the paternalism of only a big city, right? What would it take in this country to get us into an environment where a municipal government could, as Bonnie just suggested, go to their council for accountability, and you would have access to the tools that you choose to deploy? What would it take to make that possible?
Well, absent constitutional change, it would take exactly what Brian was describing, which is a premier and a provincial government that wanted to lean into its strengths and opportunity and saw, and this is a good conservative principle, the opportunity to delegate through subsidiarity to local authorities and their partners to get results. And so I'm with Brian on this point that this is not about new taxes from my perspective. This is about getting way better value for the money that's already in the system. You know, the feds have about 2/3 of everyone's money. The provinces have a little over 1/4. Municipalities have, you know, maybe 8 cents, maybe 14 when you count all the transfers. But when you survey Canadians, it's been a few years since the latest data I saw this, Canadians estimate that the feds have about half their money, provinces have about 1/4, and municipalities have about 1/4. And they trust us the most with their money compared to the province and the feds. So I think Canadians have spoken, and that clearly they're vastly overestimating what we're getting done with, or the amount of money that we're using to get the results that they trust the most. So to give a tangible example, and one of the reasons why I think, you know, municipalities in Ontario and Toronto in particular need extra resources is because they got downloaded housing without the resources to fund the mandate. And that loads especially hard on Toronto. And as a center city, you've got extra loads related to policing the inner city and so on and so forth that are really the sort of epicenter challenges that big cities need help with. And Bonnie's got her fair share of those too, and not meaning to suggest that Toronto doesn't have those issues in all of its large urban centers, because it's a real polycentric city that way. But the point here is that if we actually got downloaded some of these tasks that provinces are getting fairly mixed results for their taxpayers' dollars with, if the mandate and the resources with statutory and ideally constitutional protection accompanying the mandate, I'm sure we could get better results in an area like housing, which, by the way, would save provinces a ton of money on healthcare and justice, two of their most expensive line items, which, by the way, the federal government maintains its awkward and tense relationships with provinces by giving them $55 billion a year in the health and social transfer to get these mediocre results at best for Canadians. If they gave us 1/10 of that and the mandate to actually get things done, we could do more to save money in the healthcare system than the premiers are asking for in additional handouts from the federal government right now. So I think the money is in the system, the capacity and the trust is on the ground at the local level. We've got some missing pieces about metropolitan governance to even out and make sure that everybody in our metropolitan area is getting a piece of the action through a consumption or an income tax or some revenue that's coming from the current economy, not just from the stagnant wealth underlying it. That's where I'd want to see growth in revenues, and I'd want to see those pooled at a metropolitan scale and a functional, because the homelessness problem in Edmonton isn't Edmonton's homeless problem. It has a catchment of all across northern Alberta. And a good province would see all that and use charter mechanisms and regional governance mechanisms to even that out in ways that support better outcomes for vulnerable people and better economic outcomes for taxpayers. And I think we can get there. It's a lack of commitment at the provincial level, because we have a federal government that I think sees all this, but doesn't know how to work around this hardwired $55 billion entitlement mentality for mixed results at best from the premiers.
Okay, so then let's
obviously had enough of.
Let's go to Brian's guerrilla strategy, which is to get a premier to be bold. I mean, you know, cities are great at pilots, right? Cities know pilots better than anybody. That's how you make things change. And I think what Don just suggested is we need a pilot. We need a provincial government to say yes to taking a risk to solve a problem. They've got to see a political win in it, I guess, right? How do you imagine? I mean, a lot of cities now talk about just getting more money from the feds and more attention from the feds. Brian, you're saying something a little different. You're saying, I want a brave premier.
I think there's an opportunity right now for a premier that is prepared to be bold and visionary and to basically say, you know what, the economic recovery is going to be led in the major cities in Canada. You know, I as a Canadian, I want to see Mississauga, Edmonton, I want to see Toronto succeed. These are Canadians. I hope folks want to see Winnipeg succeed as well. And so, but you need a premier who's going to say, you know what, we're going to create a structure to allow I mean, right now on our floor of council, we can't have discussions about the real issues that our residents would expect us to Don's point, would expect us to be debating. They're not the right issues all the time. And they're not job creation. They're not economic activity.
Why?
Well, because we have skin in the game for new developments. That's where that's what we're incentivized. I say broadly speaking.
Okay.
I mean, most of the mayors that are on here, we care passionately about other issues, other progressive issues that we put a lot of time and attention to, but you got one hand tied behind your back because you don't have that formula that incentivizes everybody at city council to be focused on the things that we want to be focused on, which is economic recovery coming out of COVID, which isn't going to be a short-term effort. But if you have a premier, and I think there is an opportunity now, if a premier is bold enough, they will lead the way. And the municipalities will respond in a responsible way because they're accessible and they're accountable to their residents more so than other levels of government.
You are raising an interesting specter here, because on previous sessions today, people have said, let's get rid of the provinces. Let's just have a national government, and then we'll basically have local regional governments, I think. So you're saying, wait a sec, let's see if we can find a progressive middle one. Go ahead, Brian. Go ahead. You want to
I mean, yeah, I think the value that municipal governments provide, it dwarfs the power and the revenues compared to other levels of government. And quite often we deal with log jams in our provincial legislatures or parliaments to access federal dollars that we want to liberate and that are intended to come here. And so we're dealing with some pretty live ones right now, where the challenge is, how do you flow dollars through your provincial legislature? It's crazy.
So provinces are regional governments. They just don't behave that way because they blame up. Well, ours anyway, blames up and blames down, and doesn't leverage everything that's within its span of control and try to optimize that system within the larger system. I mean, that's how the country was designed. And I think the bigger issue is it's not really working the way it should right now. And it's just really showing up on Main Street and in rural areas with policies and outcomes that aren't serving Canadians wherever they live, whether it's broadband connectivity issues or whether it's public transit issues.
Don, do you think that the public could get, I mean, one of the points that's being made in this through this couple of days is that this is really about local democracy, that the system, as you say, isn't working, and that it's really a civic issue for people. Do you think the public could be the ones to push for this change and say we need more we're tired of housing not being solved, we're tired of, do you think it could come from that level, from the ground up?
Well, I think yes, for two reasons. One, political structures and political organizing is changing fundamentally. It was changing before COVID, but I think digitization has advanced so much that I think, we'll look back at this at a time where, because of what we've seen with mobilization around climate, what we've seen with mobilization around racial reckoning and BLM, that the way people mobilize and express themselves has fundamentally changed. And a lot of that's very borderless. And so we're seeing, I think, much more movement driven and high youth engagement, very, very rapid. This is in some ways reminiscent of some of what we were watching in other parts of the world with the Arab Spring a few years ago. So I think things are changing in ways that we'll look back on and see contributed to massive political landscape change. I think we're seeing it drive at the federal level in the climate conversation, the way that's polarized, but it's polarized in ways that is driving, much bigger change on climate than I think we all would have thought possible, that the cities and the federal government are very well aligned in, and provinces are still suing the federal government over, though I think most of those lawsuits are resolved now. And so, those things will work their way through, but I think the inexorable march of young people pushing for progress on these things, enabled by technology, made impatient by systems, outcomes of injustice, whether it's homelessness and irreconciliation on our streets, or whether it's issues of climate, I think those change pressures are there and are looking for some place for expression. They tend to find expression much more easily at City Hall. And I think that will continue to percolate, and it is the political parties that figure out how to pull that in, where the population is, where they can get seats in one of the most urbanized countries in the world, inevitably will get there. So to me, the question is, how can you get there the quickest? And I think to Brian's point, the constitutional change, three-dimensional chess was always where I started, but I think the province that just shows the way and outperforms everybody else is the other way that this can happen. And I think we've got 10 different ones to work from here. And here's the other issue, though, is that the provinces are all essentially broke. I mean, the borrowing that they had to do and their reticence to raise revenue to cover their exploding costs in their areas of poorly managed jurisdiction, because they just go back and ask the feds for more. The feds are over leveraged now. They're not going to be able to bail out provinces the way they want on health, for example. So there's a fiscal reckoning coming for provinces too. And when a province goes bust, then the jig is up, and we have to have a serious conversation about, well, what is their role and what is their accountability? And as Canadians in every other province, what do we get for taking receivership of this institution that has failed, which will happen?
Well, you heard it here. You heard it here first. The mayor of Edmonton is predicting that some province is going to go bust. I guess that's how high the stakes are. Bonnie, you were shaking your head when I said. Yeah, no, I do want to
get in on this too. So I notwithstanding, I think these are very complex financial issues, and I think it's very difficult to engage the grassroots to mobilize on these complex issues. I couldn't show people that it was to their benefit to lobby with me to remove Mississauga from the region of Peel. In their financial interest, they'd be paying less taxes, and I still couldn't engage with them on it. So these are very complex issues. To think that they could be driven by people, advocacy groups, I don't think so. I think what it takes is a mayor, maybe one of these two who are sitting here or aren't running for re-election, to go federal, to understand the plight of cities and run, next time there's an opening in the big seat for leader, and, make changes for cities. So, I'm still back where we started, that cities are owed a share of the income tax. I think that's a very fundamental, but what else can we do? And I do have some suggestions. I spent some time thinking about it. Cities need a seat at that federal table when it comes to negotiations, especially those fiscal discussions. It used to be a two-legged discussion, should be three-legged with cities. And if you added the Indigenous groups, make it a four-legged stool. Forget about bilateral agreements with feds funding provinces. It needs to be at least trilateral and go down to the cities as well. We need to be trusted to manage our own affairs, and that means to have our own consistent, predictable, and a sustainable funding. And that just depends on, what you agree on with your councils. At a minimum, in Ontario, we should be given the suite of tools that the City of Toronto has. Let us pick. And then I've already spoken about the income tax. But we need to have those kinds of meaningful discussions to go forward, because certainly the status quo isn't acceptable. And, we've always all relied on growth paying for growth, and it just doesn't anymore. Even in those municipalities that are high growth areas in Ontario, they're Milton, they're Brampton, they're Caledon, growth doesn't pay for growth. So we need to look at other sustainable tools.
Okay. We're just on the home stretch here. So 30 seconds to you, Brian, and 30 seconds to Dawn. You, Brian, first. Unmute there. Yep.
You bet. Thanks. Yeah, I'll just say, what residents can do is these issues need to be discussed at the provincial level. So they do need to demand of those that aspire to serve at the provincial level or that are currently serving, they need to see municipalities as the strategic partners and allies that they are. Who wouldn't want to see the municipalities succeed unless you're just concerned about political power? Because that the rising tide lifts all boats. Well, that's something that you would expect unless politics is largely driving their decision making or lack of ability to make some progressive changes. It's and to Bonnie's point, there is a paternalism about, well, what are you guys going to do? In our case, we have a progressive conservative government. I like to think we are actually very progressive at the municipal levels, and we're actually real conservatives, whether you have a card or not, because we know how to balance a budget. And so You know, I'm not sure what our current government is, but they're not very progressive, and they're certainly not conservative, because they don't know how to balance a budget. We do. So I think they could learn a lot from municipal leaders. They could learn a lot from many of the folks who I know that are on this call today. And I would just encourage everybody to lean into those that serve in provincial legislatures and parliaments to find out how they're going to be part of the solution going forward.
2 sentences, Don. That's all I can give you. 2 sentences.
Well, 14 balanced budgets later, I agree with everything that Brian just said. And I would just say that I don't think the answer is asymmetrical federalism. I think it's conditional metropolitanism. And by that, what I mean is before the feds give another dime to the bandits at the provinces, they need to attach conditions on it that they work constructively with local and Indigenous governments to get better outcomes for Canadians. No more blank checks.
Okay, conditional metropolitanism. Listen, you folks, you never disappoint me in terms of your energy and verve to make things better, and also to think imaginatively about how to empower the offices you hold and your colleagues at the local level to make lives better for people living in cities. So thanks for joining us. Great to see you, Mayor Iveson, Mayor Crombie, and Mayor Bowman. There's one more day of the Massey City's exciting tackling of whether the Constitution should change and what are the opportunities to relook at governance. There's a mayor's panel tomorrow afternoon as well with the Mayor of Barrie and the Mayor of London, talking with Nigel Jacob. And then if you want more details and you want to spend tomorrow with all these constitutional experts, please do go to the Massey City's conference site, and they'll be glad to see you, and I'll be glad to see you. Thanks again for joining us, everybody. Have a good evening. So good to see you.
Thanks, Mary. Stay safe,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.
Bye, Don.